hello and welcome to this masterclass, Getting Better Sleep with Analytics-Driven High-Identity Data Management. I'm Sebastien Faivre, CTO of Brainwave Jersey, an identity analytics specialized company just acquired by Radiant Logic. So we'll spend the next 50 minutes together discussing about analytics. Perhaps just to get into high-identity analytics, let's start with some background. So we actually, as a company, we compiled some statistics based from our internal researches on public reports. And we found out that up to 90% of actually former employees retain access to application, at least one application, more than 3 months after their departure. And as a company, in at least one company, we found that 43% of terminated accounts were still in use. 210. 210 is interesting. This is the average number of days a hacker is present in the computer system before launching an attack. And at the same time, 74% of organizations who fell victim of cyber attacks identify overprivileged access as the main cause. So lateral movements on over-allocated rights are at stake here. And if you're considering yourself in the safe zone just because you're inside a company and not in the internet, 26% of security incidents come from internal threats. So how did we get there? Actually, it's like, we're identity professional. We deployed IGA system. So theoretically speaking, I would say we should be covered. So with high identity lifecycle, access lifecycle, provisioning in place. So we should have enforced least privilege principles, segregation of duties, control as well. So everything should be in control. In reality, actually, we're in a situation which is a bit more complex than that. And one of the reasons is that an IGA system is actually hard to deploy and hard to maintain. But more importantly, an IGA system manages access rights at admin time and at an application level only, mainly. This is no longer sufficient in an era of zero trust, where everything needs to be protected more in a real-time approach and at every level, infrastructure, application, even at a data level. So the idea here, actually, is perhaps to change the approach and take the identity, actually, as the main source of truth in order to make informed authorization decision. So identity is everywhere. This is called identity-first security, and it is fueled by sanitized identity data and analytics. As a company, we built a framework in order to help you to deploy identity-first security strategies. So it's a layered approach, a phased approach, where you start with federating your data, so aggregating all your data, actually. Then observing this data in order to tackle data quality issues, mainly. Analyzing the data in order to better understand this information, so the identities, the accounts, the entitlements. And then running prescriptive analytics in order to automate all the IT checks, segregation of duties checks mainly, in order to somehow to clean the situation, so adopt some kind of a get clean approach, I would say. And prescriptive analytics, so in the long run, in order to keep all this information clear. So the idea here is to build this high identity data quality or high identity data lake, I would say, in order to fuel all those policy engines, whether those are IGA system, HOPA system, reback system, and the rest. So the idea today won't be to actually to go through this framework. So we'll do this in another presentation, perhaps one day. But the idea today is rather to take some insights from this framework in order to give you our feedback from the field of all the pitfalls that you have to avoid. So we'll go through here in the next, let's say, 45 minutes now, in the next 45 minutes to this framework, and we'll discuss together data modeling, we'll discuss together access review, we'll discuss role mining, we'll discuss risk scoring as well. So we'll have actually some very interesting conversation together in order to show you actually what is working and what are the pitfalls to avoid here whenever you want to deploy an identity-first security strategy. So let's start with the beginning, actually. Observe and analyze. So whenever you want to deploy an identity-first security strategy, you need to start with building an identity and entitlement data model. So basically, being able to answer to questions such as who is working for the company and who can access to what. Really, this is the basis. What we frequently observe actually, is a pitfall or a misconception between data accumulation and data correlation. And we see that most companies actually are only leveraging access logs for those purposes. So they're grabbing and aggregating, accumulating access logs. Perhaps just one statistic which is interesting. 33% of the overall amount of data that you have in the company is made of logs. 33%. So when you have this in mind, you start to realize actually that you are in some kind of an ocean of data. And if you don't run some kind of analytics on top of this, you will just sink in this ocean of data. And more importantly, with access logs, you do not have any context. You do not have any information. Those are just, those very tiny events that are coming. So you do not have any context. So you cannot actually run any analytics based only on access logs. So you need on top of the access logs, or on the side as well, to build and fulfill an identity data model, as well to have information associated to identities, accounts, and access rights. So this is the first pitfall that we see most of the time. People deploying, I won't name the products, but log management products, and considering that this is actually the identity data lake, and it's sufficient. This is not the case, obviously. It's not sufficient. So you need to build on the side an identity data model. On here, most of the time, what we see is the lack of, let's say, I would say, taxonomy. So we're grabbing information, and we're aggregating this information once again. So let's take a very basic example that I see very often. Active Directory accounts. Is an Active Directory account an identity? Actually, it's associated with an identity, but it's an account. Perhaps that you have some attributes in the Active Directory accounts which are relevant for the identity, so we'll bring them back at an identity layer, but still, this is an account. It has a login, it has a last login date, it has to be managed somehow as an account. And if you skip this phase, and if you're considering every account has an identity, then you cannot enforce controls such as terminated access, for instance, the first one that we've seen. So you need to build an identity and entitlement data model. You need to apply on this data model a taxonomy, and you need to fulfill the data model with relevant information by pointing all the relevant data sources based on the information that you want to fulfill. And then you will want to run some analysis. And actually here we see that most of the time, there's not a lot of attributes to deal with, especially at an identity level. Keep in mind that the more the attributes, the more the relationship, the more the control on the analysis that you will be able to run. On the control side especially, most of the control, I would say 80% of the control, are made in the form of identity attributes or identity relationships compared with access to resources, such as only people from the HR department can access to the payroll system. So at some point, you need to have those attributes or relationship in place. So this is something that you cannot avoid. You need to grab this information, perhaps sanitize this information, enrich this information, because the more the attributes, the more the relationships, the more you will be able to run analytics and controls then. The last pitfall is about the data itself on superficial analysis. It's true that most of the time, when you're loading information, and especially entitlements, if you end up by loading only information at a coarse-grained level, such as people on their business role, for instance, you won't be able to enforce control. If you want to enforce control, if you want to enforce control, especially leveraging peer group analysis or user behavior analysis, then you will have to grab fine-grained information. So the transactions that those people can access to, the data that they can access to. So this is the only way in order to be able to run controls such as segregation of duties, for instance. So as a takeaway here, so aggregation is not enough. If you want to start this identity-first initiative, you need to start with an identity and entitlement data model. So you need really to fulfill this data model, sanitize this data model, in order to have a clear view of the situation in the company. A 360-degree view, I would say. So then you will want to, so actually here is one, a simple example of one, a very simplified version, I would say. Most of the time you will end up with some kind of a relationship data model, because not only you will have the attributes, but you will also have the relations between the elements, such as people having a job function in a given department, for instance. So you will have all those information in place. So once you have the data model, then you will want to actually leverage the data model in order to find the needle out of the access stack. And here is a problem here. You will end up with thousands, tens of thousands, millions of access rights to deal with here. Tons of information. So the questions become, how to be able here to find the needle out of the access stack. So you have two ways to do it here. One is to adopt a layered approach, basically starting with data quality and then IT checks and control, finally analytics. And at the same time, providing all those information to the business owner, what I will call the first line of defense. Those are the people ultimately who will be able to help you to identify what is a normal situation and what is an abnormal situation. Which means that at the end of the day, data visualization techniques, user experience is at stake here, because most of those people are not IT people. So you will start most probably with building the missing links, such as reconciling or, adding labels to orphaned accounts. Then most probably you will have to run control at an identity level in order to tackle identity, let's say, data quality issues, such as people with the same name, same email, same employee number, internal people whom manager, direct line manager is a contractor, no longer working for the company, identities with 100% of their access which are dormant accounts, 100% of their access which are disabled accounts. So really this idea of compiling all those information and more importantly to provide those information back to the line manager, the first line of defense. This is something you can do actually at an identity level, but also at a data level. So at a data level, it means that you will also be able to consolidate and provide this information back to the first line of defense in order for them actually to help you to improve the situation and somehow to clean up the situation. So then, once you have applied control, you can run analytics. So running analytics is interesting because when you're providing analytics to business people, most of the time, the idea is that you will have to provide actionable analytics to those people. A way to do it is to leverage pivot table. IT people, actually, they do love table. Business people, they love pivot table. They're playing with Microsoft Excel all day long and they're running through pivot table. So they love pivot table. Here is an interesting analysis here. So how to identify actually, let's say, what is a normal situation or an abnormal situation in a given department. A way to do it can be to present this information as a pivot table. So one dimension are the identities and identity attributes. The other dimension is application and profile. And then you can apply data mining algorithm on this in order to reorder the line on the columns in order to make clusters of joint permission appearing. So here we do see that actually most of those people are sharing the same permissions here, especially at ASAP level. And on top of this, you can run temporal analysis in order to say, oh, and by the way, here is all the situation evolved with a point-in-time analysis. Because most of the time, those business people, they're running control on a regular manner. So it's not part of their daily job, so they're running control on a regular manner, let's say on a weekly basis, monthly basis. So it's also very interesting to present them a consolidated view of all the changes that occurred since the last time that they run a control or an audit. So here, are those access identical to the last time that I run an audit, or which access have been removed, which access have been added? This is very efficient, a very efficient way to present this information. And by the way, to identify that you have some new access rights here, which are quite unusual. Here it's Tracy. Okay, Tracy, she's the only one actually having those access rights here. You can also apply more advanced analysis, such as peer group analysis. Peer group analysis is a way to identify abnormal situation or behavior. So the idea is quite simple here. An identity is a dot. You compare the identities with each other. The more similar, the closer the dot. Okay, so get the trick? So you compare the identities. So then you end up with data visualization such as this one, where you end up in a situation where you quickly identify that you have some dots here far away from all the other dots on a given department, for instance, which means that most probably there is something abnormal, an abnormal situation here. Access rights, access logs, whatever. So once this is done, so there is also something that we learn a lot, which is around access review or access certification campaign. It's interesting to say that an access review is actually by far the most efficient control that you can deploy in order to sanitize your access right in a company, the situation in the company. And the reason is because you're asking to the people the first line of defense again. Those people, if the access rights are still legitimate or are still aligned with the job function of those people that are working within their department. So this is really super efficient. But the problem here, and the pitfalls that we often see here, is that when an access review system is deployed, actually there is a lot of attention on the access review campaign owner and not a lot on the reviewers themselves. So you really need to focus on the reviewer persona whenever you're deploying an access review. You really need to make their life easier because they won't spend more than 5 minutes of their time to do the review, whatever the number of entries that they will have to review. So the idea here is to provide some information in order to help them to make informed decisions super quickly, let's say in a matter of minutes. So the first thing, of course, is to provide context information, such as information associated to the account, last usage account owner, last decision taken for this review, for instance. You can also perhaps provide some information associated with control or control defects. You can also provide information such as dynamic peer group analysis in order to better understand, is it normal that those people can access those permission based, for instance, on their department or job function? So most of those people accessing to this department, to this permission are part of this department or this job function, for instance. So those are the kind of information that you can present that have been proved to be very efficient. What you can do as well is to help actually the reviewer to make informed decision and, more importantly, to focus on what is important. So what we've seen and what we've done actually is to, with the help of some AI algorithm, to help actually the reviewer to do the review in a more efficient manner. So here the idea is to say, okay, whenever this is a normal or an abnormal situation, perhaps I can review on your behalf. So if nothing changed since the last review, perhaps I can suggest that you can automatically approve this access right or this account. If this account here is associated to an individual who is no longer part of the company, conversely, then perhaps the suggestion will be to revoke the account or the access. Okay? So once again, I mean, removing everything that is obvious in order to focus on what is important because you only have 5 minutes to do the review. And then you have data visualization techniques. So you have several data visualization techniques here. The idea most of the time is to be able for the reviewer to run the review by running, let's say, some kind of a bulk validation. So one way is to present the information in a grouped way. So you can group the information per identity, per account, per department, per application, per permission. So if you know that this individual is no longer part of the company, you can revoke everything at once. So this is a way to do it. So grouping all the entries. So this is a data visualization technique, which is quite, I mean, easy, but still efficient. Another visualization technique, again, is to use pivot table. So pivot table, again, I mean, it can be used to identify what is normal and abnormal. It can be very useful in order to do the review. So here, for instance, we're reordering the line on the columns, which means that at the end of the day, instead of reviewing each individual line, we review the dimension. Because the question becomes, is it normal that all those people are sharing the same permission? So you have a look at the people on one hand, the permission. If it's normal, you can approve the whole block at once. This is super efficient as a data visualization technique to do the review because you can review really thousands of lines in a few clicks, in just a few clicks. You reorder the line on the column, apply data clustering algorithm in order really to help the reviewer to make informed decision. Whenever it's considered as normal, because all those people are sharing the same permission, you can review everything at once. This is also something that you can use for role mining. So role mining is also very efficient in order to improve your current situation. As a company, we often have this conversation with customer or prospect, okay, do you have an algorithm or something in order to help me to build a role, or perhaps to build a role for me? Actually, the common pitfall is that no. I mean, you don't have a role model in place, it's just that you did not know. You do not have a role model in place, actually. If you're running cryptic algorithm in order to find role, you will find something, but ultimately it will be very difficult to deploy. And one of the reasons for this is because there is a life cycle associated to the role. Whenever you're deploying a role in a company, you need to find a role owner because on a regular basis, you need to review the role content. Is it still aligned with the mission of the people having the role? The role user information as well need to be reviewed. And more importantly, at some point, the role owner needs to really understand the meaning of the role in order to assign the role to the individual. So what we've seen, actually a solution which actually works, is rather to have some kind of an hybrid approach. So top-down approach and bottom-up approach. So still we're leveraging data visualization techniques and data mining algorithm, but it's on purpose. So the idea is to have this top-down approach where you really start with, let's say, a department or a future role owner, identifying the people, sharing the same job function and or the same activities in the company. So this is a top-down approach. And then with the help of data mining algorithm, identifying for those people if they're sharing some permissions, actually, in the systems themselves. This has been proved to be very efficient because this is something that you can present to the business user. They understand this. So you can build the role with them. It's quite easy, actually, to do. So you start with this top-down approach. You identify, let's say, the buckets of identities based on job function, characteristic, project, whatever. And then with the help of analytics, and again, with pivot table, most of the time you can really easily identify cluster of joint permission and start very interesting discussions then with the role owners, the department lead, for instance, in order to build those roles. This is an iterative approach here that you have whenever you're building a role. So when you're building a role, most of the time, you start with data cleansing. Most probably, you will also have some kind of description in order to better understand the meaning of the permission, mainly, for those business people. And then you create transversal role, some business role as well. You document the role, you validate the role, and you start again. Okay. So you start with the most obvious one, and then on the long run, you build or reshape your role to converge somehow to your definitive role model. So this is some kind of an iterative approach that you have whenever you want to deploy role mining. But more importantly, keep in mind that you have to onboard business people in this role creation process. You cannot do this on your own only. Okay, so let's end up with some mathematics. So risk scoring. Risk scoring is very interesting. It's actually, in the zero trust era, we're moving to a world where we have to make decisions, just-in-time decision, and most of the time based on the context. So it ends up with this concept of risk scoring. So everybody's talking about risk scoring. Here I will present a way to compute risk scoring. This is not the ultimate way to compute risk scoring. I mean, this is just my personal opinion on this. But as you will see, nevertheless, there are some pitfalls to avoid whenever you want to build a risk scoring and leverage risk scoring here. So I will start with this very simple question. So John Doe has administrator access to a critical database instance. Is it a risk? Actually, it depends, right? It depends. It's not a risk if he's the technical database owner. I mean, it's just that it's super sensitive, he's the admin, right? But it's part of his job function. It's not a risk. It becomes a risk if he's a simple business user. He used to have access to this permission as part of his previous position in the company. Okay? Oh, and by the way, or left the company 3 months ago. I mean, then it's a risk. Okay. So what's the lessons learned here? Actually, a confusion between a risky situation and sensitive configuration. An admin access is very sensitive. It's not a risk per se. It's just that it's very sensitive. You cannot, you cannot do the confusion between the both. So whenever you want to compute an effective risk scoring, the idea is to base your computation on deviation, on the risk itself. Okay, so is a standard user having access to an admin account? This is a deviation. This is a control defect, I would say. Okay. And then this control defect is impacted by the resources that you can access to. So you end up, and I have an example. Next slide is an example, so it will be easier to understand. But computing an effective risk scoring can be something like this. It's like you have a list of control or deviations that you want to assess. For each individual control or deviation, you have what is called a risk level. I will discuss a little bit more on this in the next slide. And then for each individual risk level, what you do is that you identify in this situation if there is a control defect, and what are the resources which are impacted by this control defect. You make the sum of this. there is some kind of a ponderation associated with the risk level. More on this on the next slide. And then you aggregate everything to have a risk score on an identity or an account or whatever. Okay. Sounds complicated, but it's actually very simple. Let's take this example here. So imagine that John Doe is trying to connect to a system. Okay. So because we do have identity-first security in place and we have identity context, we know that actually this is an unused account. The password never expires. Oh, by the way, the password is too old. It's an atypical day and time for login for John Doe to access for this resource. And by the way, he left the company. Okay. So those are control, right? I mean, control deviation. We have a risk level associated with each control deviation. So based on this, we can do the math. We have this sense, this feeling here, which is that actually risk level number 4 here, I mean level 4, is much more important than risk level number 2. I mean, it's not that you have 3 risk level 2, that it becomes more important than risk level 4. Okay? So you have to make some kind of buckets here. Okay? Differentiate all those problems per risk level. So a way to do it, if you want to compute this as an integer, for instance, unsigned integer, is to play with bit fields and say, okay, I will compute the values based on the bit field. Let's say up to 256 risk per risk level, okay? And then I will do the math here, something like, okay, playing with the bit field. So I have unused account, 1 defect, risk level 1, plus 3 defects, risk level 2, plus 1 defect, risk level 4, which ends up with this risk score. This risk score is interesting because it can be ordered, okay? And you do not somehow mix the defects per risk level. But still, is it a relevant value for a business user? Right? I mean, like, no, obviously, right? So this is another pitfall, and it will be the last one of the presentation, actually. I often see in products, like, I mean, they're super proud of having computed risk score, so they're displaying risk score everywhere. It's just that, I mean, for a business user, it does not mean anything, right? Because what a business user wants to do is he wants to know where to start with. Okay. So instead of presenting a risk score, what you should do instead is presenting a ranking. Is John Doe in a more risky situation than this other individual, for instance? So you need to be able to present this and reorder this using a ranking level. So whenever you're presenting risk score, you still have the risk score, but what you present most of the time, which is much more valuable, is a ranking. So here, for instance, on the mask risk level, I will go back to this. So here, for instance, we have those people, and it's super easy to me as a business user to understand that I will have to start with Manuel Bennett. Number 1. I mean, computation, actually I don't care. It's just I have to start with Manuel Bennett, right? Or another scenario would be, okay, what I want to do is to address all the max risk level 4, because as a company, risk level extreme, I really want to mitigate those risks. I do not want to have risk level extreme in place in the company. So I grab all the max risk level 4, and I want to mitigate those risks. Okay, so I want to address those people. So this is really the idea. Most of the time, this is much more efficient for business user to present risk ranking instead of risk scoring. Okay, so some takeaways. So whenever you want to deploy an identity-first security strategy, you need a sanitized identity data model. It's much more than just aggregating access logs, really, You need to take a little step back on this and you need to correlate information in order to build this data model, relationship-based, most probably, in order really to better understand who is working for the company, who are those people, all the attributes, the relationships, who should have access to what, who has access to what, who has done what, who is doing what. This is the only way then to be able to fuel the policy engines, to make informed decisions. The second takeaway is to empower the first line of defense of the company, the business user. Whenever we say that the next security thing is identity, who more than business users are able to assess the situation? So you really need to refine all the user experience in order for those business users to be able to quickly understand what they have to do. So adopt some kind of an exception-based approach in your user interface to identify the problem, not a long list of access, but really what's interesting, what do I have to care about. Actionable context information in order for them to make informed decision. On leveraging data visualization techniques and identity analytics whenever possible in order to help them to find the needle out of the access haystack. Okay, thank you for this presentation. So we have a few minutes left if you want some questions or a coffee. Your choice. Yep.
How did you go about assigning values to the risk scores based on the context of the account? Like, for example, obviously someone who's been terminated, they shouldn't have an account, it should be a high score. But how do you, assign improvements over that?
So actually you have to build as well some kind of control based on the context information. So it means that, for instance, as part of the controls that we listed, there was one which was abnormal date and time, I would say. So this one is interesting because it actually needs, it means that you have to run some kind of baseline analysis on standard deviation of what we will call the standard date of time and login. It is the exact same thing at a permission level or application level. So you can also assess the resource based on peer group analysis. Are those people, based on their attributes, characteristics, so it can be the location, but also their department or job function, connecting on a regular basis to the system. So then you can add some more context information. It can be the IP, of course, the IP address, IP mask, the usual thing as well. But again, the trick is really to somehow to define this as a control, as a security control, because you need to assign at some point a risk level, define the risk associated with this. Yes? So, yep.
How can we stress out that maybe this risk will be lower when the app is more critical?
Yep. So it's true that, the more the data, the more the analysis. This is especially true for, those risk scoring situation. So this is the reason why, as a design pattern that we have now, the design pattern that we have now is a design pattern when you centralize actually the control on the identity information, most probably the authentication as well, while you stay, you decentralize and stay local all the authorization decision, which means that at some point, whenever you want to connect or assess actually the authorization, you are at the central place, so you have more information with you. It's more like a vision, I would say. So especially Gartner is presenting this. It's a vision because it's easy if you're building new applications, so you can have externalized authorization engine. For the legacy system, it's another story. Definitely. Okay. So thanks again for coming. Enjoy the event.